I am declaring war. I can see that got your attention. What am I declaring war on? Stress! Stress is a disease, people. And I am the cure. I'm a doctor with the cure. No, I'm not. I'm a general. And it's still a war. A war on disease. Stress! There's too much stress around here. The time I've been speaking, over 80 million people have died of stress. That's another one. That's another one. More. Mayhem. We've got to deal with it. Are you ready to deal with it?
No.
Say, I hate stress.
I hate stress.
No, you didn't let me finish. Say, I hate stress.
Never before in history have doctors been able to do so much to preserve your health as they can today. And almost everywhere in medicine, the parade of advances that will benefit countless millions has just begun.
Vaccines became a scientist's dream. And that means a lot of work for scientists at the World Health Organization and Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Every year, it's a race against time.
People were absolutely panicked because somebody could be playing bridge one night and they would be dead the next day.
Say what?
This team of Army medics is rehearsing, not for the outbreak of war, but the outbreak of virus. It's a battle where shaking hands can be more lethal than dodging bullets, where the adversary numbers in the billions, where nothing's constant but the body count. Viruses are things on the very edge of life. We can't taste them, smell them, or see them, but they're there. In the air, in the water, in every living thing on the planet. They're the tiniest, simplest form of life on Earth. Yet they know ways to enter our bodies, kidnap our cells, outwit our immune defenses. Once inside, the viral DNA hijacks the cell and forces it to make more viruses. Within minutes, the swollen cell explodes, releasing hundreds of new viruses to infect other cells.
Hi, I was in an Army experiment, and I'm not feeling so well. I think it might have been the drugs they had me on. I've been hallucinating. My head is just killing me. My joints are all achy, and Is this a hospital, or... I don't even know where I am.
Please proceed to the diagnostic area on the right, and have a healthy day.
Oh.
Viruses are old. Some believe they're older than all other forms of life. And they are patient. Without a living cell to invade, they wait in a crystalline form somewhere between life and death. Some can wait for centuries. Their only goal is to reproduce. Viruses are pure purpose.
That cannot subsist. It doesn't have the machinery with which to live. It can only do so by entering and utilizing another cell for that purpose.
And when it uses human cells for that purpose, we usually end up the losers. Diseases caused by viruses are as potent a force in the history of man as war and natural disasters.
Oh, shit.
One of the most common ways to make a vaccine is to grow it in an unnatural host. Chicken embryos are used to grow human viruses like yellow fever, measles, mumps, and influenza.
Influenza has been grown in eggs for many, many years. It's our standard way of producing virus. It can also be grown in tissue culture and grows very well in tissue culture, but you can't produce enough tissue culture to make large doses required for industrial use.
Say what?
Every year, flu virus is injected into eggs. After several transfers from egg to egg, the virus will have become better adapted to growing in chicken cells than human cells. When injected into a human, it looks enough like the enemy to cause immunity, but isn't strong enough to cause sickness. Then, in the 1930s, German scientists invented the electron microscope and could finally see a virus at 7,000 times magnification. Instead of bouncing clumsy light waves off objects, it used tiny electrons to magnify. One look through the electron microscope instantly changed how people defined the boundaries of life. They discovered organisms so small, billions and billions of them could fit into a single pixel on your television screen. Scanned by electrons, viruses were revealed to be spheres and spindles and geometric shapes. They looked too symmetrical to be alive.
Important to be very open-minded about what you're going to say. You need to make sure what you're looking at is actually real, so you can get quite a few artifacts, anything from dust that's fallen on your sample, which can look like a piece of sample. You can get some cracking in the vacuum, so you actually get cracks forming in your sample, which are not there, they've been caused by the microscope. Sometimes the coating can cause artifacts. If you coat too thickly, you can start to see the metal particles. And of course, if you're looking for small particles, they can look just like your sample might look like.
The environment inside an electron microscope is incredibly hostile to the living cell, so it needs to go through quite an elaborate process to enable it to survive that hostile environment. Firstly, we have a very high vacuum, and if you stick biological samples into a vacuum, they'll just escape very quickly and be destroyed. We have a very high energy electron beam, which is required to be able to penetrate to the sample. When the electron beam strikes the sample, it gets very, very hot. It can get up to 150 degrees Celsius where the electron beam actually hits the sample. So it needs to be able to survive that very high temperature.
Usually the way to tell if something's an artifact is just from experience. So spending a lot of time looking at a whole lot of different samples, you'll see these things continually appearing.
Some of the important things to think about when you're interpreting data from the microscope is, do you understand your sample well enough to be able to interpret what you're seeing? There's just a lot of information. In fact, you could almost say that you're going to be overwhelmed by information when you get to the ultrastructural level. And unless you really know your sample well, then this information could actually be misleading. Do you have enough experience with the particular technique you're working to know what has gone on during the preparation of the sample and how it may have altered your sample? You also need to think very carefully about, have you introduced bias into the way you collected your sample? You may have tended to look for pretty areas rather than areas that are scientifically relevant.
Spatter coating is popping a really thin layer of metal on top of our sample surface. The layer we'd use is between 1 and 10 nanometers, so it's nice and thin. It's not going to cover up any of the sample, but it's going to add a nice wee layer so the sample becomes conductive. If the sample's not conductive, we won't see anything. So what will happen is the electrons that land on the sample and go through the sample can't get away to Earth, so they build up inside the sample and cause artifacts, which we call charging. So we'd get our sample, attach it to a holder so it's attached quite firmly. We'd load it into the splasher coater, shut everything up and create quite a high vacuum in the coater. We would then pass a voltage over the top of the coater where the metal target is sitting, and that creates a little electric field inside the coater itself. We then bleed gas into the chamber. The gas molecules get all excited and they kind of hoon around and knock little bits of the target material off. So those little bits of the target also move around inside the chamber quite randomly, and they find their way and land on top of the sample, creating quite a thin layer.
On today's supercomputer screens, viruses look like ornaments from a Martian Christmas tree. This is the AIDS virus. Its core contains the genetic information necessary for the virus to duplicate itself.
It's a package of nucleic acid, of genetic material, enveloped in a set of proteins that allow this virus to utilize a cell for its own replication, because it cannot function independently, it cannot multiply independently.
The genes are protected by a thin shell. The shell is studded with molecules that enable it to dock with the target cell and work its way inside.
Hey, how's that essay?
Yeah, right. Well, not so good. You know, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm seeing things. I think it might be because of these drugs the Army put me on. But if you could just get me well enough to get back to base.
Right. Kick ass. Well, don't want to sound like a dick or nothing, but it says on your chart that you're fucked up. You talk like a fag, and your shit's all retarded. What I do is just like you know, you know what I mean? Like,
Even germs can get germs. An example, the T4 bacteriophage, a virus that attacks bacteria. It lands, hooks on, and pushes its DNA through the cell membrane.
It's the form of life that cannot subsist. It doesn't have the machinery with which to live.
The flu virus has found a way around the immune system by mutating, changing the way it looks. Sometimes it changes only slightly. Other years, the change is radical, and we are defenseless.
Sometimes you can get partial immunity, which will give you some protection. But when we have what we call a shift, that is usually what occurs when we have major epidemics. Then the immune system doesn't recognize the flu at all. Bears no resemblance to anything the antibodies have seen before.
It's the form of life that cannot subsist. It doesn't have the machinery with which to live.
Gila.